Hello, everyone. It is just me this morning. Kenny is trying to give me a heart attack by arriving on the Zoom later. But before we get started, I want to thank everybody for coming to this public Florida Native Plant Society Lunch and Learn. We're really happy to have you and really happy that you're interested in the carnivorous plants of Florida. As you may know, we are a membership-based organization. So if you're watching this presentation and you're not a member, I'm going to show you how quick and easy it is to become a member. Just type in fnps.org into your browser window there, and then hit the join and support button, membership info, and we have several tiers, individual, multi-member, full-time student, which is only $15 a year. It's a pretty nice tier. Anyways, please consider becoming a member. And also, we have a license plate that you can support us with. It's pretty camo. It supports our education and our other conservation and restoration work. So I hope you enjoy this presentation by Kenny. I really enjoyed filming it, and here he is.
For hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, people have been fascinated by carnivorous plants. My book on Florida's carnivorous plants is going to come out next month. And by the end of this presentation, you're going to understand how they've evolved in our nutrient-poor soils. You're going to be able to identify them, and you are going to learn how to grow them in your backyard. I started learning about carnivorous plants when I was in 12th grade. The hall monitor, the cryptic person who you wouldn't notice was there unless you were running in the hall, he came and gave a guest presentation in our AP biology class, and of the 100 or so students he saw that day, I was the only one that was really inspired by his passion. So I went up to him after the talk and I told him that I was really into carnivorous plants, and the next day he gifted me a Venus flytrap and a sundew. And then when I went to college, I met up with him. His name is Mr. Bruce Herman. He taught me how to hybridize daylilies. He told me what to look for when you're making hybrids, and he taught me a lot about carnivorous plants. And that led to me co-founding the Western New York Carnivorous Plant Society, which allowed me to move down to Florida and start my own carnivorous plant nursery. That led to me writing 5 TED Ed talks, one of which is coming out this summer, and the other one is about carnivorous plants, which we're going to be seeing snippets of. And through that, I became an active member of the International Carnivorous Plant Society, where I recently helped write 5 animated videos, which we're also going to be seeing little snippets of. So today we're going to be talking about carnivores. We're going to be talking about things that have sharp incisors, things that have toxins, and organisms that have really good grasping power. But we're not talking about animals. We're talking about carnivorous plants that have all of those same adaptations. Unfortunately, there's no carnivorous plants that are large enough to eat a human. The largest one is from Southeast Asia, and they can eat a rat, but it's not common. So the definition of a carnivorous plant is actually pretty fluid. They have to lure, capture, and kill their prey. The way that they lure their prey can be through color or scent, and then they have lots of different trapping mechanisms. They have to be able to digest their prey, which could be through their own enzymes or through the help of beneficial bacteria, just like we use in our own gut. And then they have to benefit from the digested nutrients. Carnivorous plants are not performing magic because non-carnivorous plants can do 1 or 2 of these things as well. But generally speaking, scientists say that if they do all 3 of these, that they're considered carnivorous. But the definition is more sacred than it is scientific. So researchers will argue if a plant is carnivorous or not. All carnivorous plants use modified leaves to trap their prey. There's about 1,000 species of carnivorous plants. None of them use their flowers. And what I think is really fascinating is that all carnivorous plants will put their flowers either spatially or temporally distant from their trap. So on the left, we have a North American pitcher plant, Sarracenia, and you can see some of these leaves, some of these traps aren't even opened yet, and they have these flowers that are pretty tall. So the flowers are tall, so they're being pollinated. And then down here, if the pollinator comes down here, some of the traps aren't open, so they're not going to be eaten. Same with the butterwort and the Venus flytrap. The distance between the trap and the flower helps prevent them eating their own pollinators. So in Florida, the prey that they're eating are tiny things like rotifers, water fleas, little spiders, little insects. I sell a lot of carnivorous plants, and everybody asks, which ones eat mosquitoes? And unfortunately, none of them eat mosquitoes, because mosquitoes want blood, and carnivorous plants are using scent and color and nectar. So mosquitoes aren't interested. Please do not turn off the webinar. They're still exciting. We're still going to learn about carnivorous plants. Another cool thing that evolution happened in carnivorous plants is that on the left we have a North American pitcher plant, Sarracenia leucophylla. And then in the center we have a pitcher that is being attacked by a fungus. And the fungus is made up of chitin. So a long time ago, millions of years ago, this pitcher plant has an enzyme called chitinase that helps break down the fungus so the plant doesn't die. And do you know what else is made out of chitin? Little arthropods and little insects. So what the Sarracenia did was it repurposed an enzyme that it already had, and now it's able to digest all these little insects. So that's pretty cool. But in other parts of the world, we have an Australian pitcher plant in the center, and then we have 3 Nepenthes, which are from Southeast Asia, and all of them have chitinase. All of them use the same enzyme to break down their food. So that's cool, but what's more interesting is that these pitcher plants are not related to each other. So carnivory in plants has evolved at least 8 different times in different geologic spans and in different parts of the world.
Scientists believe that carnivory in plants evolved separately at least 6 times on our planet, suggesting that this flesh-munching adaptation holds a major benefit for plants.
But those carnivorous plants are from all over the world, and we're going to be talking about Florida's carnivorous plants today. Florida is a hotspot. In the book, I wrote about 34 species. One of them is extirpated, which means it's probably extinct in the state of Florida, but it is found elsewhere in South America. And then one of the species is also not native, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So why is Florida a hotspot? We have to go back 2.5 million years ago to the Pleistocene era, which is the last ice age. The sea level went down 300 feet. The width of Florida doubled in size, and the glaciers started moving down North America. To get you an idea of what we're talking about, at this time we have giant ground sloths walking around Tennessee. We have a 7-foot, 7-inch tall camel walking around North America, and we have smilodons. So it's a pretty rough environment in North America. Then in about 20,000 years ago, Florida was the sweet spot for plants. So right here in the panhandle, you see we have a warm temperate forest. That means there's about 6 months of snow and then 6 months of summer. The Gulf is a good regulator of temperature. And what happened was there was plants everywhere, but when we had the ice age, plants that were able to migrate very slowly down south were able to survive. Some of them, of course, stayed up there, and the ones that had adaptations were also able to survive. But we get a lot of plants moving south, and we have really sandy, nutrient-poor soils, and then we start getting speciation. So we'll have one pitcher plant, but then we'll have one that can handle a little bit more water. We'll have one that has a lid that's open instead of flat. We'll have different carnivorous plants like butterworts and bladderworts that have different color flowers that are attracting different pollinators, and we get a lot of species.
Due to many factors, including naturally occurring wildfires, tall trees and other vegetation are absent or burned down before they become too large. This allows carnivorous plants to receive full sun throughout the day.
All right, so Florida has nutrient-poor soils. Like I said, we're getting different speciations. Another thing that's happening is we're getting a lot of wildfires. And the wildfires are good for carnivorous plants because although all carnivorous plants can photosynthesize, they don't do it as well as non-carnivorous plants because of the shape of the leaves and because they're either active traps or because their energy is more into digesting things. So they can't photosynthesize as well. And because of that, they need a lot of sunlight. So all of these naturally occurring wildfires are burning down taller shrubs and trees, and that allows carnivorous plants to get the light that they need. Like I said, about 20,000 years ago was the hotspot. What's interesting is that as the sea levels rise, as the glaciers recede, only a couple of the carnivorous plants are allowed to go back or have adaptations to go back up north where it's cold. So in the center we have Sarracenia purpurea, which right now is living all over Canada and up and down the east coast. And next to it we have Drosera filiformis, the threadleaf sundew, who's all the way up in New Jersey. But we have still around over 30 species that are in Florida that are stuck in Florida because they need the heat, the humidity, and our temperate subtropical environment. And what's really puzzling is that scientists do not know what makes some species able to adapt to the change of climate and what adaptations are harder for them to. What's scary is that these plants had 20,000 years to migrate up north, and what's going to happen when the climate is changing at a faster pace. One thing that I was mentioning was that carnivorous plants are tolerant of wildfires. They do well when the taller trees and shrubs are burned down. But we have lots of million-dollar homes in Florida, and we don't really encourage wildfires. They're not as frequent as they used to be. So right now, there's a lot of carnivorous plants growing underneath power lines because mowing mimics what a wildfire does. Mowing cuts down the tall shrubbery and the trees, so these plants are still getting full sun. I want to go back in time a little bit to 1770 when the Franciscan monks came over. They were talking to the Native Americans, and the Native Americans said that you can paddle from coast to coast in the state of Florida because, not in the state of Florida, but this land, because Florida is just a series of islands. So then in the 1820s, there was cartographers. They were making maps of Florida, and this is what they made. They started writing down for southern Florida river glades, and a glade is an open area that doesn't have a lot of trees. So they were on the river. They saw that it was wide open space. Then for some reason, they got lazy and they shortened river to ever. And you only save one letter, but I don't know why they didn't have time to write the one letter. So they changed it to Everglades, and it makes more sense to say that they were in there and it looks like, oh, it's open forever, but that's not the story. So they call it Everglades, and then we have the Everglades. People started moving to Florida, and what did they say? They wanted to drain the swamp. They wanted to get rid of the Everglades. In 1904, Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, which is a great name, he ran for governor, and his motto that won him the election was "Water will run downhill." He said he was going to drain Florida and turn it into a Jeffersonian agrarian utopia. Frank Stoneman, who was a writer for the Miami Herald in the early 1900s, said that the Everglades is a wasteland. He agreed with Broward, but he said it's going to be too expensive, too much time, and it's not worth the cost to drain the Everglades. Mann Jennings, at the same time, she was the president of the Federation of the Women's Clubs in Florida, and she was also the secretary for the Preservation Committee. And she started looking at surveys of the Keys, of South Florida, and she started realizing that we have plants and animals that are found nowhere else in the world. And it would behoove Florida, and we could probably even have a tourist industry if we start saving large swatches of lands for people to come and visit the wildlife and the plants. She was nicknamed the mother of Florida forestry because she started a couple of national parks. Around the same time, we have Minnie Moore Wilson. She, as you can see by the picture, is Caucasian, but she started living and being really integrated into the indigenous people's lives. She visited and worked with the Seminoles and the Miccosukee tribes. At this time, the Europeans, Caucasians, were forcing the Native Americans to live into this harsh Everglade environment, and she thought it was unright, injustice, but she also saw that there was a connection because between the Native Americans and the Everglades. The Native Americans were able to hunt and fish and live in this harsh environment, but she wanted us to protect both the people and the environment. A little bit later, we get to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which is a name I'm sure we've all heard recently. She said, "It's a woman's business to be interested in the environment. It's an extended form of housekeeping." This is in the 30s and the 40s. And she's the daughter of Frank Stoneman, the person who said the Everglades is a wasteland and we shouldn't bother changing it because it's too big of a project. She was really interested in wild places. She started researching the Everglades, and in 1947, she wrote a book, The Everglades River of Grass, and then a few months later, the Everglades National Park was created. Then when she was much older, when she was 79 years old, she started the Friends of the Everglades, and now we have hundreds of acres in her name because of her efforts. She was also only a little taller than 5 foot, which I think is a good fact to know. So why was I talking all about the Everglades? Because 1 out of 3 of our state's carnivorous plants reside in the Everglades, including a very endangered carnivorous bromeliad species, and there's only 3, as of now, there's only 3 carnivorous bromeliads. Another thing I wanted to point out is that diversity in species and who is in power is a benefit. Because of those women, they had a different viewpoint, they had a different understanding, and because of them, we have large pieces of land in Florida that are protected. So the rest of the presentation, we're going to be talking about exactly what is in the state of Florida regarding carnivorous plants. The first one is Dionaea muscipula. I'm going to use the scientific names. In the book, I have a whole section about scientific names and taxonomy and why it's important. And I mentioned earlier, there's about 1,000 carnivorous plant species. All over the world, people have a different name for the different plants, except for the Venus flytrap. You can pretty much go anywhere and say Venus flytrap and people know what you're talking about. So why are we talking about the Venus flytrap? Originally, they're from the Carolinas. There's a 60 kilometer radius in the Carolinas, but about 50 years ago, they moved down here. And the way that they moved down here was somebody started planting little bulbs and little baby Venus flytraps in the panhandle, and that population still exists today. There's natural checks and balances which prevent them from spreading, so they're not invasive, and we call them naturalized. So how does a carnivorous plant work?
Each lobe has 2 to 4 trigger hairs. Once a trigger hair is touched, an electrical signal is sent to the other lobe. This electrical information is translated into a chemical calcium wave. One touch of the trigger hair does not make the wave of energy large enough for the trap to close. If the trigger hair is touched again within 20 to 30 seconds, the action potential electrically excites the trap and the lobe snaps shut. If the insect doesn't trigger the hair a second time, they get to escape. Insects that aren't lucky are imprisoned by the teeth-like cilia.
Each Venus flytrap has a bunch of lobes. On each lobe, there's 2 to 4 trigger hairs. If you touch a trigger hair, if a bug touches a trigger hair once, a tiny little calcium action potential wave occurs, but the trap doesn't close. If you or the bug touch it a second time within 20 seconds, the second action potential is bigger than the first, and that causes water to get pushed from the inside of the cell wall of the lobe to the outside. And because water is moving, that causes the trap to snap shut. It takes 4 to 10 days for them to digest their prey, depending on the prey size. The more the animal struggles, the tighter the traps close and the more enzymes that it pushes into the trap. Each trap can only digest about 3 times. So that means it can only open and close and eat about 3 times. The picture on the left is one Venus flytrap. It has about 10 traps, so that means it can eat about 30 times. And each time that it eats, though, it's getting nutrients. And with those nutrients, it can grow new leaves. Carnivorous plants, generally speaking, have a much higher leaf turnover rate than non-carnivorous plants. So if you're growing them and you're noticing that a lot of them are dying, it's not something that you don't necessarily have to be concerned about. The picture on the right is probably 2 Venus flytraps, but you can see there's probably 20 traps, and there's lots of black, but then in the center, there's a lot of new growth. The next group of carnivorous plants we're going to talk about are the Sarracenia pitcher plants. In the book, there's distribution maps, and I wanted to show you that most of them are in the western part of the panhandle, but we do have one that's more in the center. The way that a Sarracenia works is on the lid, that's kind of like a giant landing pad. On the underside of the lid, you have nectar. Bugs will come to it, they'll drink the nectar. In many of the species, there's a chemical called choline in it, and that makes the bugs a little tipsy, a little drunk, a little intoxicated. They'll go down into the pitcher, and there's these hairs, which we'll see a picture of in a little bit. And the further they go, they fall into the digestive enzymes, and then it takes 2 weeks to 2 months to get broken down.
As the choline takes effect, the fly grows sluggish, stumbles, and falls down the funnel into a pool of liquid at the base, where he drowns. Enzymes and bacteria in the liquid slowly break his body down into microscopic particles the pitcher plant can consume through its leaves. Occasionally, larger prey also tumbles into the fatal funnel of the pitcher plant.
About 120 years ago, a scientist figured out all of the different zones of a pitcher plant. The top zone is very attractive. It lures the bugs. The second zone is very slippery. The third zone is where they produce their glands, their digestive enzymes. And then the fourth zone is where the digestion actually occurs. This little pitcher plant, which is native to Florida, Sarracenia rosea, and another one, Sarracenia purpurea, those are the only two that have a fifth zone, but scientists are still not sure what that zone does. Here's a couple of species that are native to Florida. We have Sarracenia alabamenensis, which means it's mostly from Alabama, but we have a subspecies here in Florida called warei. And then you can see the other one, we have a rubra subspecies with Gulfensis as the subspecies, which means it's in the Gulf. Sarracenia, we have lots of Sarracenia flava varieties. Flava means yellow, so they have yellow petals. But on the right, you can see that beautiful rim of nectar. So if you're a wasp, you can imagine, oh, look how attractive this is. You have a big landing pad, and then you get nectar. And then when they go on the underside of the lid, that's where the danger is. So this is Sarracenia flava. We have lots of different varieties. Like I said, we have ornata on the left. We have rubra corpora on the right. This is the same species. This is Rugelia. It's also known as the cutthroat pitcher plant because it has a little red on the throat. But it's kind of amazing that scientists consider that all of these are the same species. The next one is Sarracenia leucophylla. These are the hairs that I was talking about. So the hairs point downwards. So when the bug tries to back up, the hairs poke them, and then they get discouraged and they go further down. This is also called the white top pitcher plant. These little white window panes are called areoles, and scientists believe that when the sun comes through, the bug thinks that these are doors, these are openings. But as they go further down, they discover that they're closed windows. The next one is Sarracenia minor. It has this little tiny lid. This was the first pitcher plant ever to be discovered in the 1500s, and it took scientists 300 years to figure out that they were carnivorous. The next one is Sarracenia sedicina. It is also known as the parrot beak pitcher plant because they have this little sharp point at the tip. You can see that they're more closed, like compared to the other pitcher plants. And what's cool about them is they can live in super saturated environments. They can be flooded, and they're more decumbent, they're horizontal, and little tadpoles and little mosquitoes can swim in there. And the hairs still encourage the small organisms to go deeper into the pitcher, and that's where they get digested. The last pitcher plant we're going to talk about is Sarracenia rosea. Rosea refers to the flower, not the pitcher, because we have Sarracenia purpurea, it looks very similar, but it has purple flowers. Sarracenia purpurea, which we talked about earlier, can go all the way up in Canada, all the way down the East Coast. It's the most studied pitcher plant And what scientists have found is that there's at least over 30 species of inequilines, which are organisms that are dependent on the pitcher plant. So living inside the pitcher plant are protozoa, algae, rotifers, mosquito larvae, fly larvae, caterpillars. And it's like a little mini ecosystem. The reason why is they don't really have strong digestive enzymes. Their lids are more open, so they're allowing rainfall to fill up their pitchers, and then they use symbiotic bacteria to break down their food. And with all these pitchers, I'm sure you are thinking, wow, those are some really sexy Sarracenia. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about. These are 3 pitchers of naturally occurring hybrids. That's because Sarracenia are very promiscuous. So here is a list of all of the naturally occurring hybrids that can be found in the state of Florida and neighboring states. I put a little star next to one of them, Sarracenia purpurea times rubra, because I do have a carnivorous plant nursery and I have a lot of these and they're beautiful. Nothos species is a hybrid between 2 species. So that's just the name of that. But if you were to take Sarracenia flava times rosea, and then you would take that and as the female and you times it by something else, got pollen from Sarracenia, that wouldn't be called a nothos species, that's called a complex hybrid. And the way you get hybrids naturally or man-made is through their flowers. We've seen their flowers before, but now here's a nice picture of a flower that's cut in half. And this is how they do not self-pollinate, and this is how we get all these hybrids. So let's say you're a bee, you fly up underneath the sepal, and you go over here, and you're going to go over the stigma, which is where the seeds are formed. And then you're going to run around this upside down umbrella and you're going to collect pollen. And then when you're done getting your pollen, you're going to leave through this tiny opening of a petal. And then when you go visit the next flower, you're going to go up and over the stigma and you're going to brush off the pollen from the last Sarracenia. So if you have pitcher plants in close proximity, you're going to get a lot of hybrids, and that's what you see in the panhandle. You'll see swarms of hybrids, large populations of mixed pitcher plants. And that's how you can get really beautiful cultivars, which are cultivated varieties. And at the end of each chapter in the book, I have a section called Commonly Cared For Carnivores, where I list plants that are easy to find in cultivation that you can grow in your backyard. The next group of carnivorous plants are the Utricularia, and that means a wine flask, a leather bag, or a bagpipe. So you can imagine these are going to be very fun plants. Oh, and it looks like not that impressive. But when you look at them up close, you can see how intricate they are. They're very complex traps. This is not through a microscope. I don't know if I mentioned that. This is just when you're looking it up close. So here's a little bladderwort, and you can see there's all these little trigger hairs in the front of the trap. And what happens is when a little bug or a mosquito larvae or a tadpole swims by, there's some scent and they are attracted to it. They get close and they get sucked up. Bladderworts are the fastest of all carnivorous plants. They can snap their shut in about 1/10 of a second.
Their bladders, which grow underwater or in the soil, have a trap door that swings open, vacuuming up the prey, which range from microscopic organisms to mosquito larvae. Digestive enzymes are then pumped into the bladder.
If they get something a little bigger that doesn't fit all the way in the trap, they will attach to it, they'll digest it, just that bit, and then they eat a little bit at a time. This is a picture of a beautiful Utricularia geba, but it's also a picture of Utricularia olivaceae. So that tiny little white plant that's full grown. So you can imagine it's a little hard to, if you don't know what you're looking for, it's going to be hard to find them. We have more than a dozen Utricularia species in the state of Florida. Most of them have yellow flowers. Here's an example of 2 species. On the left, we have Utricularia inflata, and on the right, we have a different species. We have Utricularia radiata, but they look very, very similar, and it would be hard to know if that's just not a baby Utricularia inflata. So in the book, there's a big table. One way is One of them has cylindrical floating devices and the other one has tapered floating devices. So here's a bunch of different Utricularias that are from Florida. On the bottom, you can see one has a horn. You can see on the bottom, you can see other ones are more round. The top left is Utricularia subulata, those yellow flowers. And if you grow carnivorous plants, you'll probably have some Utricularia subulatas growing because they're kind of like herpes. Once you get them, you cannot get rid of them, and they'll just spread throughout your carnivorous plant population. They need nutrient-poor soil, so they're not going to be growing in your backyard or in other pots. They're just going to be growing in your carnivorous plant pots. The picture in the bottom middle is the one that's extirpated. So we may or may not have 3 species of purple-pink bladderworts, but this one is probably extinct in the state of Florida, but it's doing pretty good in a couple of countries in South America. And then these are the 2 purple species that we can find. The next group are the Pinguiculas or the butterworts. Here's some distribution maps. You can see there's a lot of them throughout the state of Florida. And the way that they work is it's called a Flypaper trap.
Others do not move their prey and absorb their meal wherever they landed. These plants tend to eat insects and other small arthropods.
So they are sticky. The entire leaf is sticky. I bet you have just seen a video of one eating. And they eat tiny little fruit flies and fungus gnats. The ones that are native to Florida are not that great to add to your windowsill or your kitchen, but there are several other species from Mexico that are good to add to a place where you have little fruit flies. So here's some species that we have. If people are going to grow them, they usually grow them for their flowers and not for the fact that they're carnivorous. And here's some more. You can see that there's lots of different, in each species, there's lots of different color variations in the flowers. This one is really beautiful, planifolia. It's the only red-leafed one, although some of them can be anthocyanin-free, which means they could still be a green leaf. So you can't just look at the leaf to identify it. They can live in really saturated waters. They can still eat bugs under the water. And like Lily said, they look like piles of tongues. The last one that we're going to talk about for the butterworts is primuliflora. It has a primrose-like flower. These are very common in cultivation. You can easily find them and grow them in your backyard. They multiply quickly because they can be propagated through vegetation. So at the tip of each of their leaves, they can grow a bunch of little pups, and then you can separate them and start your own little colony. This is my favorite picture of the entire book. It's this beautiful clear water system with a big mound of these Pinguicula primulifloras. The International Carnivorous Plant Society just had a photo contest, and somebody won it with a picture that looked very similar to this, but they took their photo in the state of Texas. The next group is the sundews or Drosera. You can see they're pretty scattered throughout the state of Florida. We have a couple that are very tiny. Brevifolia means short leaf. Then we have capillaris, which is red. We have Drosera filiformis, but the variety is Floridiana. So I told you earlier that filiformis can go all the way up to New Jersey, but ours is more orange and red, and it can handle our temperatures. We have Drosera intermedia, which likes to live in pretty wet areas. And then Drosera tracei, which is pretty large, and it has green compared to the filiformis, which is orange and red. They produce a flower on a really big scape. They have one flower a day, and each flower can turn into 20 or 30 seeds, and you can propagate them through seed very easily. Also, these Drosera tracei die back in the winter, and they form these little hibernaculas, which are these little winter resting buds. And if you start with one plant, when they die back, you'll get a bunch of little bulbs, and then you can separate them and you can propagate more. The last carnivorous plant that we're going to talk about is one of the 3 carnivorous plant bromeliads. We have Catopsis. It's only down in the very south. It's carnivorous because in the center of the bromeliad, it has dead organisms, and it can digest those organisms with the help of symbiotic bacteria. Non-carnivorous bromeliads do not do that. So yes, they can hold liquid in the center, but usually they're like a little breeding ground for mosquitoes and things. And this one eats more than it eats more than the others. So conservation, there's about 268,000 angiosperms, flowering plants, that we have documented and we have named. The International Union for Conservation of Nature has evaluated 3% of that large number. And according to PowerPoint, that is what 3% looks like. Of that 3%, the IUCN has said 70% of the plants that we've evaluated are either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, which is not a very good track record. Carnivorous plants are disproportionately threatened and endangered because they need really specific environments. The sundews, their biggest threat globally is agriculture. For Sarracenia, this is in order. The biggest one is natural system modifications, people building developments, malls, houses. The next one is invasive species. The next one's pollution. Then overcollection, which is poaching, and then also agriculture. And then for Utricularia, it's also pollution. So pollution is like eutrophication, where people are putting a lot of pesticides and they're putting a lot of fertilizers on their lawns. Then it gets washed away, and then these bodies of water get too many nutrients, and fish die and plants die. What's something interesting is that the University of South Florida, David Jennings, said that insecticide use above, within, or below the recommended treatment level can be harmful to carnivorous plants. And master gardeners from UF-IFAS are quick to point out that backyard gardeners are much more likely to misuse insecticides and pesticides than big agriculture. So you can still do your part. Now, why do we care that carnivorous plants are disproportionately endangered and threatened? Well, let's say you have a speciesist mindset. Let's say you value humans over all other organisms. In the past 10 years, scientists at Harvard looked at the Nepenthes pitcher plant, which is from Asia, and they looked at the anatomy of the pitcher plant and they duplicated it. It's called biomimicry. And from the pitcher plant, they have been able to create oil and frictionless, oil and blood transfusions, self-cleaning windows, and a bunch of other very slippery surfaces. In Southeast Asia, historically speaking, people have used the Nepenthes to cure burns, use them as an eye wash, use them for drinking water. They've used them to help with childbirth pains, and they've used them to cure asthma. Back in the States, we have looked at extracts from Sarracenia purpurea, and we have found that extracts stop the herpes virus from spreading. All right, so let's say you are not a speciesist. Let's say you value all life and all nature. Well, Aldo Leopold, a famous naturalist, forester, said there are some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. But now we know that we all rely on healthy ecosystems, and we should value diversity in ecosystems because diversity leads to resiliency. So we want to protect these swatches of land. So how can you help? I do a weekly radio show, and just recently we had an expert on microplastics. So I said, how can we fix this microplastic problem? And my co-host said, you need to stop using plastic. But the professor said the biggest thing you can do to help is educate others. Because if you stop using plastic, that's a little action. But if you tell 10 people and they stop using plastic, and then they tell 10 people, that's how you get movements. That's how you get things to change. Another way you can help carnivorous plants is by joining and supporting the North American Sarracenia Conservancy. They buy up large pieces of land on the East Coast, all the way over to Southeast, all the way over to Texas, to help save highly endangered Sarracenia species. You can join the International Carnivorous Plant Society and donate to their conservation funds. and you can plant native plants in your yard. So the last little bit, we're going to talk about how to grow Florida's carnivorous plants. The biggest thing is water. They need pure water, which means rainwater or distilled water. City water, well water, has too many contaminants, fluorine, chloride, minerals, salts, so you're going to need to use pure water. And carnivorous plants, unlike your common house plants, your backyard plants, they want to be very wet. So one easy way is to put them in a tray. This is called a 10-20 tray. And you're going to sit them in an 1/8 to 1/4 inch of water all the time. One Sarracenia in a pot will look nice, but if you put a bunch together in a bog, that will look nicer. So one way is you could get a bathtub, you could get a kiddie pool, you could get a cement mixer, fill it with some soil, which we're going to talk about next, and then you plant a bunch of different things. Like you could plant a bunch of different native Sarracenia, some sundews. You could also plant the Venus flytrap. So this is just one way to display the plants in a more natural way. Another way, on the bottom left, you'll see some of the plants are on shelves in a pond. You can grow them on a shelf in a pond with fish or without fish. If the water is good enough for fish, it's good enough for the carnivorous plants. The soil that they need to be in needs to have no fertilizers in it. So something that's really historically has been used is peat and perlite, like 50% peat, 50% perlite, or 50% sphagnum moss and 50% perlite. But because of the pandemic for the past 2 years, it's been very difficult to find sphagnum, and a lot of people now are not wanting to use peat because it's very hard to source the peat sustainably. It is a little easier to find sustainably sourced. Some alternatives are coconut core, which is a fine part, or coconut chips, which are a little bigger. It's not a problem, but one thing is that these coconuts are grown along oceans, so there's a lot of salt spray. So you're going to need to soak the coconut products for 12 to 24 hours and then dump the water out, and then soak them again for 12 to 24 hours and then dump the water out and then do it a third time because you really need to get rid of all those salts. Another thing that I've been experimenting with is pit moss, and pit moss is post-consumer cardboard and paper products. It kind of looks like stuff that you would put on the bottom of a guinea pig cage. You cannot just use that. You're going to definitely have to add perlite to it, or if you wanted to add a little moss or some of the cocoa products, that's a good alternative. Generally speaking, all of the Florida native carnivorous plants want full sun, except for the butterworts that would do better in a little dappled sun. And I just wanted to mention this. I sell a lot of nepenthes, which are the tropical Asian, Southeast Asian pitcher plants. They're not native, but I wanted to show them to you because these are more frequently available at a plant sale than the native species. They need the same requirements. They need pure water. They need soil they need a substrate that doesn't have fertilizer. And the one difference is they do not want to sit in water. They just want to be moist. And then the other part is they do not want full sun. They want bright, indirect sun. And in the back of the book, I have charts, and I have a chart of how to grow all the carnivorous plants. And I'm very happy that the Florida Native Plant Society invited me. And I want you to think about the quiet people who are full of knowledge. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I did see a couple of questions, one of which is from Andrew, and he wants to know what the cost of like those false triggers for the Venus flytrap. And just in the past year or two, we figured out how the traps work. I used to say that the traps could only open and close 3 times and then they would die, but that's actually not true. They can only digest 3 times. So if you or a stick or a raindrop accidentally gets the Venus flytrap to set off, it opens up after about a half an hour, and there's really no harm done with the flytrap. Another question is, can you use RO water? And RO stands for reverse osmosis. And a lot of people have that in their kitchen systems already, and they want to drink that. So yes, RO water is fine. If you want to be specific, actually I have it right here. You can get like a $10 total dissolved solid water meter stick. And Florida's carnivorous plants need 50 parts per million or less. Reverse osmosis water should be 0. Tap water in my city is like 400. So that's many times bigger than 50. So that's definitely not safe. The Asian pitcher plants, the Nepenthes, the tropical pitcher plants, they can go up to about 100 parts per million. But sundews, flytraps, Sarracenia, they really want as close to 0 as possible. And if you accidentally give them tap water, which has a higher parts per million of total dissolved solids, which includes minerals and salts and things like that, that number will slowly build up over time. And that's what causes the plants to deteriorate. So if you guys have any other questions, feel free to type them in the box. I really appreciate you guys all sticking around. Also, I'm wearing, in the recorded video, I was wearing Utricularia inflata shirt, and now I'm wearing a Sarracenia purpurea shirt, and you can purchase them at the International Carnivorous Plant Society's website, and the proceeds for that go to the Conservation Fund and the Education. And Valerie, we're getting lots of thank yous, which I appreciate. But I don't think there's any more questions. And you're muted, Valerie.
Yes, I'm not sure. My microphone went out again. As people might remember, 2 lunch and learns ago, I hit my microphone and it died for a while. And so it just died again. I'm not sure what's going on. Anyways, maybe it's time to upgrade. I wondered if you could go over real quick what native plants, what native carnivorous plants are available for people commercially.
So it's a little tricky to get the species of Sarracenia, but they're definitely available. And then there's hundreds and hundreds of hybrids of Sarracenia. So those are easy to come by. Pinguicula primuliflora is the most popular butterwort available. Drosera filiformis and Drosera tracei are the 2 sundews that are readily available. The other ones aren't available because of a lack of interest. They're just so tiny and people really aren't into them. But the filiformis are beautiful in red, and then the tracei are even bigger and green, so people like those. And for bladderworts, a couple like Utricularia gibba, and then a lot of the terrestrial ones are kind of, I'll say that they're a weed in carnivorous plant collections. They're definitely not going to become invasive or a weed in your backyard because they need to be in soggy soils. But if you get a little plug of them, like a 1 inch by 1 inch square, they usually migrate to your other pots. And then you have a little flowering Utricularia collection pretty soon.
Cool. And you sell plants, right? So you're an ethical source of...
Yeah, so that's what Tucker's asking, like, where can you find ethical sources? So pretty much all of the Sarracenia that I sell and other people sell, especially the complex hybrids, are man-made. They've been in cultivation. They've been popular for about 40, 50 years. So they're definitely ethical. There probably dozens of them are in tissue culture, so they're being mass produced. If they have a cultivar name, like Jutha tip soper or moriae or maroon or velvet, then you know they're ethically sourced because they're a cultivar, and the only way you can keep that cultivar is by replicating like breaking the rhizome and growing new plants from it. We're doing tissue culture, so they're definitely not taken from the wild.
And is there something that people should watch out for? Maybe if they can't identify all these species, or they need to watch your video, like people in the back of vans, or never going to Lowe's, like we tell people for other kinds of native plants, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So in the book, there's a whole section about how to identify plants that are, have been poached and which ones are ethically sourced. One way is if a vendor only has like one or two and they're very large and they have weeds, if the substrate isn't like perfect, if it isn't peat, but it like looks like it was dug up, then definitely don't buy those plants. The plants that I have like dozens to 216 of each cultivar or species, and there's no way that you could poach those. So you can like look, they all look similar to each other. They're all the same size. They're all healthy. Carnivorous plants specifically, when you dig, if you're going to poach them and you dig them up, there's going to be a lot of dieback. They won't, they just won't rebound. So it's not impossible, but it's like hard to keep them alive if you're going to take them from the wild. Yeah, so a lot of people are asking, or people have seen sundews. Yeah, sundews are pretty popular if you know what you're looking for. Yeah, capillaris isn't threatened. Any other burning questions? If you go to my Facebook page, I have a lot of events. And this weekend, I have a big plant sale in Tampa. And then June 25th, 26th, USF Botanical Gardens is having their summer sale, where I will be selling carnivorous plants. And then there's going to be 30 other vendors selling herbs, fruit trees. I think Virginia Overstreet's still on. I don't know if the Suncoast chapter will be selling plants. But the summer sale is the smallest sale, and then the spring is the biggest, fall is the second biggest. But literally thousands and thousands of people come to those sales.
So I just dropped your Facebook page link in the chat so people can go there.
Thank you.
My dogs are probably about to lose it because there's a person with their dog in the front yard. So sorry about that. It's actually. And then, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, and you, Valerie, put in the description, if you want to pre-order the book, you guys get a 30% coupon code.
Yeah, so look in the YouTube link description or the Facebook description. And Christine is asking, where are the best places in Florida to see these plants in the wild?
So, depends on what you want. The Panhandle is the best place for Sarracenia. The Everglades is pretty good for seeing a lot of Utricularia species. The tip of Florida is the only place where you can see the endangered carnivorous bromeliad. And then all over Florida, we have a couple of species of Pinguiculas and Droseras. So generally speaking, you're going to need to find a wet, boggy, saturated soil area to find these plants. In the book, there's a distribution map for most of the species. And like Lily mentioned at a different talk, we don't really want to be advertising the exact location of all of these plants because we don't want to encourage people taking from the wild. So in the book, I just say the county that they're found in, but if you go to a lot of different state parks in the Panhandle and you are following the guidelines and staying on the boardwalks, you'll still be able to see several of the species.
Right, so I mean, we have carnivorous plants throughout the state, right? So you could pretty much go to your nearest natural area as long as it has wetlands involved, and you're probably going to find a ping or a sundew or something.
Yeah.
But if you want to see white-top pitcher plants, you have to go to the Panhandle.
Yeah. For 6 out of the 7 Sarracenia, you got to go to the Panhandle.
But
And
here-
like the two best times are in the spring when they're flowering, and then in the fall, several of them will put up another set of pictures. Summer's difficult because you have to fight the rains, and they get eaten up by the heavy rains.
And at least here in Central Florida, our hooded pitcher plants are often in areas that are subject to prescribed fires. And so in the summer, we'll get, all of our pitchers will get burned, which, I mean, is cool and they come back just fine. But, that's something to keep in mind if you're doing a field trip and looking for them.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank the society, but I also want to thank everybody who came and listened.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming to another one of our Lunch and Learns. Next week we have a video of Lauren Anderson from FSU doing a tour of his herbarium with Lily. So I'll have to edit that video and get that ready for next week. And fingers crossed we'll have him live to answer questions. If not, we'll have just Lily. He's very busy. And then hopefully, I have a lot of video of Kenny's nursery that I would like to edit and make available, but I have to go through the whole process. So hopefully I'll make that available perhaps the week after. So we'll see how my schedule is. And thanks, Kenny, for letting me come see your place and for doing this talk for us.